Yo guys, what is up? Max on Borderlands 4 video, and today we're going over my Half-Life Harlowe build. Now, this is a status effect Harlowe build. Basically, we're taking a lot of the lessons and techniques that we learned when making the Wildfire status effect Amon build and applying it instead of 2 fire dots, 2 radiation dots on Harlowe. This is a build that I wasn't sure if it was going to work. We did a bunch of different skill trees, a bunch of testing, and the final product is a build that does massive radiation dots that can clear rooms of enemies and one-shot bosses. It's a super cool build. It's definitely not the easiest build to put together. You do need some very specific gear. However, once you have that gear, it's a really, really fun setup. I hope you guys enjoyed the build and the breakdown. Let's get right into it. So let's do an overview of the build, and then we'll get into the specifics. So the idea of the build is we're using the Field Scientist class mod. This reads that whenever Harlowe shocks an enemy, she automatically entangles and irradiates that enemy. Whenever Harlowe entangles an enemy, electric arcs shoot out of that enemy at other nearby enemies. Now, on the Amon status effect build, the way we were able to achieve so much dot damage is his capstone, that whenever he applied a fire dot, he'd apply a shock dot. Whenever he applied a shock dot, he'd apply a fire dot. And then we'd just buff up all of our fire damage, but we'd proc with shock dots. We're kind of using the exact same mythology here, where we're going to be using really high shock damage weapons. Shock rolls way higher dot values than radiation does. However, the radiation will scale off of the initial dot value of the shock, and we've got a bunch of buffs to radiation damage. So whenever we proc a shock dot, we're getting like 3x that dot as radiation. So the scientist is enabling us to do this playstyle. It's very, very important for this build because it's basically more than doubling all of our dot damage. Now, the next important thing to understand about dot damage is even though the card says this is 21,000 damage, this damage scales with our on-hit value. Meaning if I hit an enemy in the toe with no buffs, I'm going to proc a certain amount of dot. But if I amp my shot, I have a bunch of buffs up, and I hit them in a crit, whatever that damage that procs on the enemy is going to proc a higher dot if we do a higher amount of initial damage. So what we're focused on with this build is a lot of kind of one shot or first shot buffs. We're going to be buffing up the damage of our shot and our initial shot, and hoping that that is enough to basically one-shot everything. With this setup, that is how it works out. You can one-shot bosses, and you'll just room clear, because with this setup, whenever you proc a dot on one enemy, you're going to be proccing dots on tons of enemies. So the ad clear on this is really, really cool. So let's get into our skill tree. So I personally am using a group study for this build. Group study gives us a bunch of stacking gun damage. All of that gun damage does directly translate into dot damage because of what we just explained. If we hit harder, we proc a higher dot. And we're grabbing some things in Green Tree that are huge for us, such as action at a distance. Whenever we apply a status effect to an enemy, we gain a chance to apply that status effect to each entangled enemy. This leads to room clear on this setup because your dots are going to be deleting things. We've also got neutron decay to give us more gun damage. This is going to allow us to get a bunch more dot damage. I've got 3 points into confirmative reality. This is a bit of a weird one where if you're using a Katagawa sniper, you need 1 point here. If you're using the weapon that we're shooting, you would need even more points to get your cooldown back quickly. Most of the time, to get our action skill back, I just swap to a Katagawa's, shoot once, and then we'll have our action skill back pretty much immediately. And then I put some 2 points into absolute zero so that whenever we freeze an enemy, our action skill slows down. We don't have a great reliable way of freezing enemies, so we are going to be having to reproc group study quite often, just kind of how this build works. We could have gone all the way to Blue Tree and picked up Flash Freeze to constantly freeze everything with every shot. However, we'd miss out on a ton of dot buffs, and then it would literally just be the Infinicrit build. So we're not doing that, but we are going to grab Excited State for a bunch more crit damage. We're going to be critting. Our initial shot always crits basically on this setup, which leads to higher dot damage. And then we went for Distribution Function, which is going to give us more shield restore. We're going to be using an amp shield with watts for dinner, so that whenever we're shooting, we're getting bonus shock damage. So having our shields full is going to give us a ton of extra damage. And Nuclear Winter, if you did not know, this bonus damage counts as action skill damage. So anytime we hit an enemy with Nuclear Winter, we'll be critting and restoring our shield. That's part of the reason why this setup is so powerful. Now, I originally tried going for Demon Core on this build using neutron capture as a way to get big bonus radiation damage and set up as a red tree build, I found that was just strictly weaker than going neutron capture. However, we still really want some red tree buffs, so we're going to be grabbing fuzzy math, which gives us increased status effect chance. This isn't the best buff for us because most of the time we have 100% status effect chance anyways. However, there's not really anything else that we care too much about here, so I just put it into fuzzy math. Then we grab elementary for more status effect damage, more elemental damage. Put some points into enriched for increased radiation damage, which is very valuable to us. And the great red dot, 36% status effect duration is huge. Shock is the shortest dot value in the game. Shock dots only last like 2 seconds. So this is going to help our dots last a little bit longer. Get an extra tick of damage, particularly on radiation, which is nice. And then we've got Poison Sun for more radiation damage. And lastly, Chain Reactor, that whenever we deal damage to an entangled enemy, we deal bonus radiation damage. So this is even more bonus radiation damage on top of Nuclear Winter, which is going to give us bonus cryo and bonus radiation damage. Now, 2 things I want to point out is our entanglement uptime is really good on this build. 1, because our class mod gives us ripple effect. So whenever we kill an entangled enemy, we automatically entangle a nearby enemy. As well as because we're dealing action skill damage on every shot with Neutron or Nuclear Winter, every shot will proc entanglement. So every time we shoot an enemy, they're guaranteed to get entangled, and every time we kill that enemy, they're going to be spreading entangle. So our entanglement uptime, even though we are using group study, is actually pretty great. For the guns on the build, the main gun that I'm using most of the time is a Stellium. These can roll huge shock dots. Any Maliwan shotgun can. I don't know if the highest valued name is still the Stellium. Mine is a 21k dot. I've heard of these going as high as 29k. So I definitely don't have the highest damage one, not even close. But you're looking for basically a Maliwan shotgun that has a very high shock dot value because we need to be proccing shock dots in order to proc radiation dots. And shock dots roll really high values because radiation damage or because the dot length is so small. So shock dot and Maliwan shotguns is kind of the main thing that we're looking out for. The Katagawa's Revenge is just a ridiculous sniper rifle. It guarantees rolls in shock, and while it doesn't proc the biggest dots, it procs a ton of them. So Katagawa's Revenge is really good for this build, very helpful for mobbing. And then the Complex Root is also really sick. I have a Jacob's Complex Root in Rad, which doesn't really help me. I would love to farm a Jacob's Shock Complex Root. Would potentially be ridiculous on this build. I just didn't have one. There were some kills that we did with the shock version, and it was very, very clean, very smooth. But I just didn't have a Jacob's particular part for this setup. For the rest of the gear, we're using a triple bypass with amp. Amp does increase our dot damage because it increases the amount of damage that we do on hit, which increases the dot value follow-up. So amping up your shots prior to shooting them, particularly at bosses, doesn't really matter for mobbing, but for bosses, it's a huge dot damage increase, which is awesome. As I mentioned, the Scientist class mod is what we're using. I think my rolls are decent. I honestly didn't really farm any of these. I only had 2, and this was the better one. I definitely think it's super helpful to get points into Ripple Effect. I wouldn't want to miss out on that. That's super helpful, and as many points into Action at a Distance for the status effect spreading is also really, really nice. For our shield, we're going to be using a Watts for Dinner with amp. Mine's got 150% amp. As long as you have amp on this, it'll be great. Plus, you get bonus shock damage whenever we have overshield. We have overshield up basically all the time on this build because any time that we deal damage, we are going to be getting a shield back. I've got a crit knife on. Crit knife is not necessary for this build. Most of the kills that we're doing did not throw this. However, we don't have a way to make our dots crit on this setup. We can make our initial shot crit, but we can't make our dots crit. So if you do throw a crit knife on this setup, it will deal way more damage. But once again, most of the footage, if not none of the footage, actually showed throwing a crit knife. And then lastly, the piece that really pulls this whole build together is the volatile icon. Now, my stats on this are pretty terrible. Shotgun status effect chance doesn't do anything, and gun accuracy doesn't do anything. However, the volatile icon will roll with primed potency. Guns with Maliwan license parts have a 100 status effect chance on the first bullet after reloading. That's why we're constantly shooting and reloading, because it gives us a 100% status effect chance. That's why I said the status effect thing in our skill tree is not super valuable. However, if you're using something like a Katagawa's or like a complex root or something that you're not constantly reloading after every shot, that status effect chance can be nice. But most of the time, shoot, reload, shoot, reload, shoot, reload with the shotgun. And we also got Transfuser on this. On kill, guns with Maliwan license parts spread their active status effects up to 3 nearby enemies. This is not needed, particularly because we are using the action at a distance. So if you don't have a legendary version of this, you can just use a purple. It honestly might work out better. I probably could be doing more damage on a purple with some good buffs, such as like gun damage, gun status effect chance, and gun status effect damage. Would potentially go crazy. Actually, I guess the best would probably be gun damage, gun crit, gun status effect damage, or even splash damage would be good too. But probably should have swapped this for bossing. Basically, shoot gun, reload, and everything will be dotted and everything will die. For our firmware, we're going to be racking, we're racking high caliber. The main thing that this gives us, well, projectile speed's fantastic for our slow firing or slow moving Maliwan projectiles. Gun damage on this is multiplicative, so that's great. But the real kicker is bullets pierce enemies on just about all Maliwan guns. This is a huge damage increase. Because, for example, if I shoot this guy, I can proc a 47k dot on him, right? But if I shoot him and get a second hit on him, there's a 94k dot. 75. Basically, you can hit an enemy on the initial pass through and then hit them again on the splash to deal a whole lot more damage, which is really nice. There's 94k. So high caliber does a ton for us. It's basically double DPS. And then I picked up heating up. Gun reload speeds increased by 20%. This is huge value for a 1 out of 3 where you're reloading constantly. So this is just really, really nice. And then airstrike, 1 out of 3 for the splash radius increase. Once again, when we double hit an enemy, we basically deal double damage. So getting extra splash radius just makes it a bit easier for that double hit to occur. Doesn't actually increase our damage, but it makes it more likely for that double hit to occur, which is, once again, double damage. So very nice there. For our specialization points, we're using Riddle You This for more gun damage, Killer for even more status effect application chance. If I had more points, I would have loved to mess around with compounding and overkill. However, I went for 1 shot, 1 kill. This is really nice. Our Maliwan shotgun has a ton of base damage. It's like a 5k shot. If this crits something, they're just going to get one-tapped a lot of the times, even before the dot takes effect. And then that overkill damage is transferred to the next shot, which if we then shoot that overkill damage at a boss, they're going to get a huge dot. So 1 shot, 1 kill for this setup is actually really, really nice. I wasn't using it on our previous dot build, but it helps a ton. And then lastly, I just use Now with Caffeine so that if I'm not pulling out a Katagawa's, I can just Repkit myself and get my action skill back. Basically just kind of a lazy point. If you don't want to constantly swap to the Katagawa's to get your action skill back, you can use Now with Caffeine. If you're fine with swapping to your Katagawa's every time, I'd probably go with either Overkill or Compounding Inflictions as the last specialization point. I do want to walk through a quick boss rotation because with having to reload and having an amp shield, it can be a little bit complicated because, for example, if we need to shoot to reload, but that would get rid of our amp shield and we want our amp shield to do damage. So just like the quick setup that I do before I boss is I put out my my halo and I make sure that my gun is shot so that my shield can recharge, proc our halo again, so we get a few things, then we reload, then we amp, so the buffs are fresh, and then we can shoot, proc those dots, and, you know, kill our enemy. But you kind of want to, like, do a little bit of setup on this build, which the setup is because the, like, this next shot buff, guns with Maliwan license parts have 100% satisfied chance on the first bullet after reload. This isn't an infinite amount of time. You basically need to shoot pretty quickly after reloading, and if you're shooting right after reloading there, now I don't have any amp shield. So I make sure that I shoot like before going into our boss rotation so I can just reload without ruining our amp, and then we can actually amp, which stacks, and then shoot. And that will get the amp of our Repkit and the amp of our shield. And then with our halo buffs, it's typically enough to just one-shot a boss. And you want to just make sure that you're kind of like aiming / shooting down so you can get that double hit with the splash damage. Guys, that's going to do it for the build guide. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what builds you'd like to see next, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Take care. Peace.